So, hi everyone. I'm here with John Willoughby today, who's the director and co-founder of Elenev. And so, Elenev are in the sort of the data science, dynamic scoring, data analytics kind of space. Very much on a sort of dynamic basis. So, John, thanks very much for joining me today. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's good.
So, the first question I suppose I wanted to ask was, how have you found the marketplace changing over the last sort of 2 years? In particular, you're quite close to the data in terms of like how that's been sort of changing for companies. I mean, how have you seen the data change, or have you seen the dynamics change over the last couple of years from your data sets?
Yeah, I think we've definitely seen in the data, particularly with regard to financial vulnerability, we've definitely seen that change. We've seen a as you'd expect, a degradation in within financial vulnerability within over the country. So and in areas where perhaps originally you'd think actually that was a fairly resilient area, and we're seeing some reduction in that resilience. So yes, we've definitely seen an impact.
And is that pockets by market? So I remember you've got quite a good sort of like geographical detail around sort of where it kind of sits. I mean, do you see? I mean, there are definitely areas of increased vulnerability or increased financial difficulty or resilience, so let's call it that, versus others, and whether some that's kind of surprised you or have changed from what it would normally be.
Yeah, so one of the areas, so we do kind of we're a geospatial kind of scoring shop, so we don't take individual customer data, so we can step aside GDPR. And we take a large set of data across the UK at postcode, sub-postcode level, and just really above the individual. So again, we're very conscious that we don't want to know who's behind that data. So we take those large data sets and we take outcome data from our client base. And we apply machine learning, and that allows us to say something about the UK as a whole at that kind of granularity. And we use that for a variety of services to clients.
I mean, it feels like the pandemic sort of thrown things up in the air a little bit, and some of the preconceptions we had before maybe aren't quite right in terms of how that might have affected people recently. But then, does that really impact us going forward as well? I mean, what's your kind of view on that? Do you think things have changed for good, or do you think sort of now we're going to sort of get back to almost like the old ways of working as it was like 2 or 3 years ago?
I think then we're going to come on to this, and I'll probably say exactly the same thing in a minute when we come on to it. But you take call centres, and we'll probably talk about call centres during this. A lot of the call centres are relocated to places like Glasgow, and that's driven by cost base. Now with remote working, those individuals that are servicing those contact centres can now drop the Glasgow contact centre, go and work for a London, and they still do exist. You'd be surprised, a London contact centre, and get paid better. And what that's going to do is going to force, and we can already see this. You go and look at some of the advertisements for contact, outbound telephony staff, and you can see, you can see the salaries are beginning to rise in areas, like Glasgow, because they're now competing with remote workers that are able to service anywhere in the UK. I think levelling up that levelling up agenda is going that the government have. I think in some ways, COVID's going to the impact of COVID's going to kind of force it.
Yeah.
I think.
And what do you think that means for the contact center industry? I mean, there's a certain amount of sort of comfort around having people in your contact center physically in terms of like security, data security, privacy, policies, procedures, those kind of things. And we've all been working remotely over the last 2 years essentially. I mean, nearly all of us. and it's so attractive, and yet you don't get some of those security pieces. Do you think there's going to be how do you think that's going to evolve? Do you think we'll end up going back to the office, or I mean, can a distributed contact center really exist, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a distributed contact center in the US. They have them there. They have quite some very interesting, as a result of that, they have some very interesting services where they can do load balancing essentially of contact center staff. So when demand peaks, they can just push out of the the contact center. If they need more staff, they can just push that into the kind of the home worker type space to meet the demand. So and I know the rules and regulations in the US are different to in the UK, but they're able to do some interesting things with that distributed network. I think in the UK, so I had a similar question to some of my banking clients at the beginning of the pandemic. You do inbound and outbound dialing. What are you going to do? And they said, what's and heads of op risk, I talked to them about it, and they said, well, we have the VP, we have the digital infrastructure to increase security, and we're rolling that out with the kit on the laptops, the various VPN, dedicated VPN type services, etc. And also, we get staff to sign attestations to say that they are, adhering to the kind of the policies and procedures that we require of them. So, yeah, I think it's an increased risk, but I think businesses are responding to that. I think we will slowly over time see a move back to, the consolidated centre. I think, in terms of the other thing is in terms of that increasing cost base, isn't there? I mean, I think we're going to see salaries rise. I think that we're going to see that for two reasons. I think because of the distributed network, and also because of, we're under increasing inflationary pressure. So I think we're going to see salaries rise, and I think that's where it's almost a plug, isn't it? That's where the likes of LMF can come in and support, with their data insights, support more, increased productivity, increased, contact rates, for example, etc. So,
and that's also going to be my next question, which was, what's the role of data, do you think, that is going to play sort of going forward in the future, especially if we get to distributed contact centers? Everything's much more remote. Even the consumers or the people who are borrowing money in, I suppose, in the financial services world, they're much more remote and interacting more digitally. What's the role of data or the importance of data, and how does that sort of like flow through our processes?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting, and there's multiple angles to this. There's the angle I have as a data seller, but there's also the angle that you see from the regulator. So the Customer Duty Act is really quite interesting from a data perspective. The proposal that came out earlier in the year, and the outcomes testing, that every step of the customer journey, the FCA is going to expects outcome testing, and that puts a data demand. It's not just the data demand on the lender. That data is there anyway. They capture for a greater, or they catch that data, but it's actually now more about investing in that data, actually spending time analysing that data and questioning it from a validity point of view when they think it where it could be wrong. So for example, some just capture the vulnerability of a customer, and they capture that through interactions with the customer, and of course they've got to request from the customer that they can record that detail. And then one of the firms I was working with, that they when they talk about the vulnerability identifiers they've got, and when they compare their number of clients, the number of customers they've got that self-identify as vulnerable, it's a lot less than what, say, the regulator is saying or other external
I heard that,
vendors are saying. And so, that almost calls into question the mechanism by which they're capturing that information and the validity of that.
But there's also a bit of an ethical question there as well, to a certain extent, in terms of like, so if I don't want to identify myself as vulnerable, but all of the indicators are saying that, I likely am, in probability, do you recall that person as vulnerable? Do you treat them as vulnerable, or do you only do it when they actually say, well, yes, I am, and I need the help? And at what point does that line kind of split, right? So when does it become such a compelling case that you say, well, look, we're going to have a bit of an intervention here?
Yeah, and I think there's two answers to that. I think the first answer, if we just split, we're talking about financial services.
Yeah.
And this is where we kind of come back to, it's one thing talking about vulnerability, but actually what the regulator is more interested in is the harm that financial services can cause to people. And there's broadly I would argue there's two types of harm we can cause the customer. We can cause them financial vulnerability. We can cause mental harm by the stress of the situation. And those are the two harms that we can cause. Now, there are other types of vulnerability. There's physical health. There's capability and non-English speaking. That type. Those are the vulnerability metrics. But they're more for the customer journey. They're more for how the customer wants to interact with the institution. And I think if the customer doesn't want to say that they're physically impaired, or doesn't want to acknowledge a difficulty with language, English might be a second language, doesn't want to acknowledge that's entirely up to them, because that's how they choose to interact with the lender. I think when we get to the harm that the lender could potentially, through a lack of service, cause an individual, so it might be financial vulnerability, the lender can see that especially organisations where banks that are taking in primary accounts, they can see the financial stress that individuals are under, and they have that data. And so at that point they can be monitoring financial vulnerability.
Yeah,
and we should be calling it out.
So do you think we're thinking about vulnerability wrong in a way? I'm not saying we should change it as much as just like, do we need to change the paradigm and how we look at it? So really, it really is about outcomes, right? So it's around outcomes and avoiding harm. And but our language is being sort of at the front end talking about vulnerability and the causes rather than the outcomes in a certain extent. Do you think?
I think there is it's easy to just talk about vulnerability, and it's nice and don't we do a great job on vulnerability? It's hard to talk about the harms we do to people. And I think really it should be an about turn, and we should be talking about, actually, if that individual banks with us, if that individual uses our lending services, what harm could we cause them? And how do we support, how do we ensure that we reduce that? I think harm is the key. Identifying what harms you can cause, which is going to be stress or financial hardship.
One of the most interesting things I think is almost like is feedback loops, which I think is going to come out. So we're talking about outcomes here. So we've gone from the front end of the customer journey, talking about causes to outcomes, which you can measure. But then it's almost like it's the feedback loop to then say, well, then, okay, you can't stop it happening with this particular customer. How do you then feed that back so it goes back up the process? And that it's almost like that feedback loop piece, which is perfect machine learning to a certain extent, because you're training against outcomes, right?
Yes.
It's like, how do you do that to then identify things earlier? I think that's kind of fascinating, I think.
It is. And I think, I think that's what's interesting about the CP, the FCA, the FCA's CP, and increasing use of outcome as a measure and reporting to.
And how much do you think that's going to play into machine learning, and how evolved do you think we are in that? I mean, it sort of crosses over in some of the stuff that you guys do, but I mean, it seemed like it's something that can be done. I mean, I know in places it is being done, but it's like, how much more can it be done, and how evolved do you think the industry is on doing that?
I think we have pockets of it. I don't think, we all talk a good talk about AI. AI. Yeah. It's a set of if statements, really, and you can see that because when you ask it a question, it can't answer you. It can't answer you, and it says, "Do you want to speak to somebody?" Yeah, I'd love to. Yeah. So I think we are seeing AI and machine learning interchangeable, but increasing in the space. In terms of drilling into internal data, I think that's got some way to go within businesses. I think we're only at the start of that. I'm not talking about LNF here, but I think a lot of the lenders are really starting that. They're still trying to understand what that, how to apply it.
And it does feel like almost like the use cases are sort of like almost like they've almost like struggled to a certain extent, but it really does come down to outcomes, doesn't it? So we were chatting a bit for around like, what's the outcome? You can measure an outcome as being a contact, or you can measure an outcome being a vulnerability, or you can measure it as being someone in debt or sort of financial harm, and it's almost like those outcomes can then drive the methodology. And so it's the outcome that's driving the need as much as the technology looking for the need.
Yeah, and I mean that's certainly how we went about our when we started out, how we started to develop our product suite. It wasn't we need to apply machine learning AI at any cost, we must do it. It was more, what can we provide our clients that will reduce their cost base, really, and that's really been at the heart of everything we've kind of approached. So an example is the capital modelling that we do. Our view is very much why hire a quant to do a particular type of capital model and keep them. But if you're a challenger bank, and it depends on the customer. But if you're a challenger bank, you probably don't want to keep a quant on your books full time to calculate operation risk capital. And so we from our backgrounds know how that is calculated and provide that as a service. And the hope is that that's novel. Perhaps we can reduce the cost of having a quant there and use you guys as our 10 quants with your model, and that's reducing the cost base for our client, and so then that is just an example. And it's similar with the contact stuff we're doing. It is, we had to apply machine learning. It was, can we reduce the cost of a contact? The pound cost per contact, can we reduce that? And the answer is yes, we can. And data and machine learning helped us to do that. So I sometimes think that there's this, that we must apply machine learning at all costs, but what is it we're going to apply it to? I think we're still perhaps a little bit in that phase.
And so we talked a bit about, I suppose, capital modelling. You talked about capital there. You talked a bit about contact propensity. You talked a bit about vulnerability, financial difficulty propensity. What do you think the next sort of outcome, almost like use cases? Where are we not looking that we should be looking to try and leverage that, to leverage, I suppose, that kind of thinking? Do you think? Are there new frontiers that are coming up? Because I do feel that vulnerability has been a frontier for a while, and it's great to see that that's now really being closed, right? But where do we go next, do you think?
I still I still wonder that are we closing vulnerability?
Yeah.
So, you know, I would. There's a lot of people out there that say they're doing vulnerability, but I don't think
More to do.
You know, I don't think we are. We won't until the regulators can robustly challenge. You know, what really should happen is that regulators should be able to robustly challenge the claims that are being made, and they need data. They need data to do that and stand up to. You know, so when a bank decides to close a branch in an area that's has a high propensity for financial vulnerability, they can stand up to the bank and say, look, we our data assets, or our external suppliers identified this area as has a high financial vulnerability. You all want to close the branch. It's more likely that in that area individuals are not going to be able to respond to branch closure. They're already close to asking them to travel 5-10 miles on the bus just to come and see you, or asking them to afford the internet or buy an iPad just to interact with you. Some people are not going to do that, and those people are going to become financially dispossessed in those areas. And so until the regulator starts to meaningfully challenge, I don't think we have solved it.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's still more to do, and it's more granularity in the same topics, right? So,
yeah, I think that's it. I think there's more to do. In terms of the next steps, you would expect to see more kind of product type development, but I think the regulator is question a certain amount trying to question that in terms of the application of machine learning for that type of thing.
Yeah, so I suppose just touching on that, I suppose in terms of like transparency, and that was a topic for a while, particularly around machine learning, and particularly on the lending side, right, which is a little bit different, maybe on the fraud or even the vulnerability side, I suppose, but to a certain extent. But it's like, what's the latest view on transparency? I mean, is that going to continue to be a topic? Are you making strides on that, or is that concern sort of fading away a little bit?
I think like the barometer for a lot of these things is what the large consultancy firms do.
Yeah.
What are they doing? So I still see thought pieces coming out about transparency. I think like you say, when that is driving lending, or when it's driving capital, then rightly, or even
false negatives as well. False negatives would be the concern, right?
Yeah, I think when it's driving those types of models, I think where it has a direct impact on the P&L, I think that's audited and the capital that's required, I think there is a need for transparency. On our side, on our end, we're doing it as we wouldn't want to start to share details of how we do things because it's commercially sensitive, and to a certain amount, what's the transparency? Well, our transparency is the fact that we can deliver a benefit, and the benefit, if the benefit isn't there, then guess what, you won't buy it. So I think it depends on the application of the tool. It doesn't need to be transparent across the whole industry or the whole application. It needs to be transparent on those areas where people are, making investment decisions, etc. Yeah,
I mean, I suppose it comes back to your harm conversation, doesn't it? So if it's value added insight that's on top of what they would have before that prevents more harm, then you're probably going to be okay with that. But if it's lending and you're denying people, even if there are false negatives around vulnerability, and it could result in harm, then that's where it'll get more difficult, I would think.
I think so.
The other question that comes up is really around bias, right? So there's bias in the models and those kind of things, and just, it's the fact that they're trained models, and if the training's not been right, then does that introduce bias? I suppose I think that'll probably come through at some point.
Yeah, I think so, and I think that's something that, particularly on our vulnerability, on the things that we can demonstrate an uplift to a certain amount. So, for example, the contact. To a certain amount, the uplift, we can demonstrate that uplift. So, use our product and you'll get a gain. And so those types of, they are a consideration, that those shortfalls are a consideration, but perhaps not as immediate to say the vulnerability piece. So, so we wouldn't, we strive to eliminate error and bias in vulnerability. And we do, we work with other firms to do comparisons. So we've worked with with Helen at the VRS to compare our data and their data, and broadly we see the same type of outcome. So that gives us added comfort. We it is a consideration within models. But again, I think it's on the application of the model. What's the model being used for?
Yeah. So it always needs that human element to a certain extent.
It does.
Yeah. And so just going to talk a bit about the debt sale market, I suppose, and pricing. Talk a bit about capital there. I mean, we've had quite a bit of a shock, I suppose, the last sort of 18 months, 2 years, and the data strikes me. The data over the last 2 years is not quite the same as the data it was the previous 2 years. And it might not be the same as the data that's going forward. And you sort of see some of that change in some of your data. How much of a challenge do you think that's going to be for firms to get pricing right, to really understand what's going on from a dynamics point of view?
We've had payment holidays. We've had, we highlighted, the FT highlighted cases of where CRA data is going to be, accuracy is going to be eroded by the pandemic. And certainly we've heard on from various sources of kind of internal process failures at some of the lenders that have meant that the data they're reporting back to the CRAs isn't perhaps as accurate as it because of payment holidays as accurate as it could have been. And so I think there is a challenge for that type of modelling approach. It's dependent on that type of data. I think ours, to a certain amount, so long as we're getting, the foundation data we get is updated continuously, and then the outcome data, we were still getting outcomes through the pandemic. There were points that where I think in a very we did see a drop off in outbound contact. But that came back pretty quickly. So I think it depends on the data source. I think some are challenged, some are probably going to be.
And what about future things you're kind of worried about? I mean, we talked a bit about the economy, some of the economic impacts. I mean, anything that you think's on the horizon that we've got to look out for? I mean, obviously you see changes in vulnerability or resilience, right? I mean, that's something, one aspect for sure. But is it anything else or?
Yeah, I think we kind of touched on that earlier. Was the inflation? I know it's a supply side type inflation. So so there is a debate whether it's here to stay, whether it's just a flash. But I think the assumption for firms is that it's here to. I think you've got to look at this and think, actually, is now the time to invest? We're going to get through an inflationary cycle. Then maybe now I should be, investing in my company. We've had a little bit of stagnation, around Brexit and through COVID. Is now the time to increase the effectiveness. Invest in our operations, increase the effectiveness of our operations, and increase productivity. We've been through a period of reduced productivity. I think now perhaps is the time to invest and increase productivity. Ahead of
What could be? There could be inflationary increases.
Yeah. And I think that from the business side is the question: is now the time to do it? And I think I personally think it is. I think
And I suppose because there's always a lag there between, I suppose, inflation and prices going up, and then the cost. So if you sort of like invest now, then the cost of capital is going to be longer. So like doing it now is probably going to save you money in the longer term.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Yeah. So now's the point.
Yeah. Well, John, thanks very much for the time. I really, really appreciate it. Definitely got some great insights on data and how to look at data as well, right? So how to look at data and think about it and sort of build that into modelling. I mean, I think that's fascinating. So really appreciate the insight.
All right. Thanks for the opportunity. It's good to chat.